challenge in court, just to preserve, basic values and rights and protections for our citizens. The job, I think, has really been transformed. And so a little bit about me, I spent the better part of the last decade at the U.S. Attorney's Office. I was the chief of the Financial Fraud and Public Corruption Unit for the Justice Department here in Connecticut, supervising about 20 federal prosecutors and legal staff, plus dozens of federal agents all over the state engaged in both criminal and civil investigations into fraud, corruption at the state level, municipal level, in contracting, fraud extending to Wall Street for the manner in which they traded residential mortgage-backed securities in the aftermath of the financial crisis, to investor fraud, investment advisors ripping off seniors, to embezzlement from employers. So that's the type of work that I was engaged in. A lot of that, when it comes to kind of leading public interest lawyers, I think is what's going to be required of the next Attorney General. And so with that, I guess I'd defer to my colleagues here to let them make some remarks, and then I'd be happy to take any questions.
Yeah. Well, I'm John Shaban. I've been practicing law for about 26 years, mostly big civil law firm practice. I started in New York law firm anyway, Kelly Dry and Warren. We actually had an office here in Stamford, so I bounced between New York and Stamford. Now with Whitman, Reed, Abbott, and Morgan. Most of my practice has been on the civil side, big commercial civil litigation with dalliances into areas that actually are relevant to what the Attorney General does. I have an environmental law degree, so I get involved in environmental issues, obviously. I've done antitrust litigation. I've done some FERC work, with either ratepayers or actually, issues with the federal government about how you interplay with the siting council and ratepayers and some local zoning issues that overlay on all that stuff when you're placing utilities or infrastructure. For 6 years, I was a state representative from 2011 to 2017, elected 3 times. I was the head Republican on the Environment Committee on the House side. I was served with Paul on the Judiciary Committee for 6 years, which was a lot of fun. And I was also on the Finance, Revenue, and Bonding Committee, which was an interesting glimpse at kind of the way we raise money and spend money as a state. I got into the Attorney General race probably for similar reasons that my colleagues here have, is trying to continue on a path of service in the way you think you can best serve, and being an attorney. And actually, the Attorney General's office actually stands in a unique position, different than some states. Actually, we not only represent some of the agencies of the state, but we first and foremost represent the citizens of the state, and which puts us at times in a spot where we can push policy and or help guide things to land in the right spot while protecting the citizens of the state. We can't create policy, we can't drive it or draft it, but you can drive it, both from what you do and what you choose not to do. And that's sort of the central tenet of how I'd like to see our AG's office run, is have a slightly better throttle on what we do and what we don't do, because I think part of our problem as a state has been our business unfriendliness. I think we scare away businesses large and small. My clients in particular have moved out of the state for sound financial reasons. They can't put down stakes without getting hit with a new tax, new law, and new regulation. And I always sort of shock people when I ask how many civil actions do you think our current Attorney General brought in the last fiscal year? And people, throw a number out. It was over 20,000 civil actions brought in the last fiscal year. Now, many of those civil actions have to get brought, and there were laudable goals and laudable cases. But there's a tone that I think that has been left over from previous attorneys general, more so than George. I think George has done a better job than his predecessor, where it's sue first, ask questions later. And I'd like to see our AG be part of the solution to help restore some of the promise and prosperity of the state by talking first and suing second, if at all. And if you read my materials or go to the site or whatever else, I talk about a business liaison's office in the front of the house, which I think some AG's offices do. We haven't. I think we should talk with people in a private setting before you start suing people. So that's kind of a broad brush of who I am and how I'd like to see the AG's office run, and we could chat a little more about that over lunch.
Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Doyle. I'm a Hartford County Bar Association member and lawyer. It's my pleasure to be here in Fairfield County Bar Association and Fairfield County in general. I've been a lawyer in Greater Hartford area, small firms, general practice for about 26, 27 years. When I got out of law school, I wanted to do small firms. So I've done criminal, civil, estate planning, probate, real estate, whatever, pretty much everything except I stay away from family law. I'm a smart man, if people know it's a tough law today. But, so I've been 26 years, 27 years as a private sector lawyer. In addition, I've been in the legislature 24 years. I served 12 years in the House, 12 years in the Senate, and so I have a lot of legislative background. Prior to that, I was 3 years in local government, town council, so I have 27 years in public service. As John indicated, most of us are the same way. We basically, I was planning to run for re-election to the state Senate until George made the surprise decision not to run again in mid-December. At that point, I thought about it. I said, you know what, maybe I'll go for it, because you can help more people with this job. As mentioned, this is and it's confusing. The term Attorney General nationwide, there's all sorts of different forms of it. In Connecticut, as you know, the lawyers in the room know, it's just a civil position. So basically, the chief role, I look at it, is to be the chief people's lawyer, civil lawyer for the state of Connecticut. And as Chris mentioned, of course, I think whoever wins is going to have to be, when appropriate, challenge Washington if there's some lawsuits that challenge on the environment and the like, which I think George has done a fine job on. Whoever wins will support that. I also look at it in another room. As the people's lawyer, I want to try to be a big advocate for the people. One of my ideas is to bring a 24-hour consumer hotline so people can come in anytime, call in, get an immediate call back, and then get a call back from staff within 48 hours, business hours. Because I look at it that you're really the chief people's lawyer. I would try to get the data in, finding out how the people are getting scammed, and then the Attorney General's office can actually define what the big scams are and use the bully pulpit of the office to challenge that, to get the word out. And the common example lately is the IRS scams that you're all aware of. If anyone calls you, it's not the IRS, but it's a common problem. Despite some efforts to publicize it, vulnerable people are still getting scammed and they're still wiring money. So yes, the job is you're the chief civil lawyer for all the agencies and the administration also. And I think my legislative experience would enable me to, I know the agencies well. I think that would enable me to do a good job as Attorney General. But in just closing, I think George Jepson's done a fine job. My decision would be based on the law and based on what's best for the people, not necessarily my own personal ambition or press conferences. It's really focused on the law. I think George has done a much better job than a couple other prior Attorney Generals. So I would try to serve in the tradition of George Jepson. So again, I thank you and try to answer some questions.
Who's got a question? Someone's got a Victor. You always have questions.
From my experience, I'm a family law lawyer.
God bless you.
Yeah, right.
Don't go for the bench. The bench are getting killed. Yep.
A great many of the actions that have started, start as attorney actions, child support actions, and like. I'm just wondering if you don't practice family law and you don't have an appreciation for it, what is it that you can do to the office? How are you going to change the process?
Well, I would say I don't practice a lot in family law. I've been chairman of the Judiciary Committee the last 2 years. I've been a member of the Judiciary Committee the last 22 of the 24 years. I've watched the whole evolution of the pro se's, the rise of the pro se's, so I'm intimately familiar with it. You're probably aware there's a small minority of family court litigants that are basically trying to tear up the entire family court system, try to bring down judges statewide. So I am, being a legislature, whereas I'm not in court, I'm certainly very, very well versed in the family law. But again, whoever gets elected here, I mean, we all have our particular set of skills, and like anything, whoever wins is not going to be an expert in every area of the law. I may not be an expert in family law, but I've been involved and exposed to it in the legislative process, and as any lawyer is, I'm a general practitioner, and you get a case and you deal with it. So I don't think that's a fair comment, because all of us have our experiences and our specialties. But again, it's a civil position here.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the reforms that need to take place in the family court system probably have to come from the court side about how we do things, or the Judiciary Committee. And even though I was 6 years, not 20-something like Paul, I witnessed the same thing, whether it was revamping the way GALs are being done, challenging judges. At every kind of stage of the game, there's improvements being made and assaults being made at the same time, because it's through some personal experience and then family experience and then tangentially through some of the stuff my partners have done, you watch it. I mean, family law is a difficult area because, for the obvious reasons. The reforms that have to get made won't come from the Attorney General's office. However, they could kind of be, I think, you put some tailwind on them. There is an entire DCF or a child protection department in the AG's office that basically does what it has to do to protect children and chase deadbeat dads and do that kind of thing. But like Paul says, how many lawyers are there now? 200, 200 some odd. Yeah. It used to be the biggest law firm in the state. I don't know if it's not the biggest, it's, top 5. A lot of the reforms that could get pushed by the AG's office are going to come from the people who've been practicing in there, and hopefully get some input from practitioners as well, from guys like you, because we need it. We've seen in the Judiciary Committee every year, it was just people up there trying to crucify judges for usually what I consider to be vendetta. Not always. I mean, there was some laudable or viable complaints, but everyone's got their eye on the ball. But it's got to come from a couple of different issues, a couple of different efforts. It's not going to be all AG.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when it comes to the Attorney General's representation of DCF and then also doing child protection work, the most important thing is making sure that that unit is properly staffed with Assistant Attorneys General that know their stuff and that can adequately serve DCF and adequately serve child protection interests. Because if you don't have people there who can kind of move the work, that's when I think you start having situations where children are in danger or where litigants in the family court system feel like their cases aren't proceeding as quickly as they should. And so in many ways, I think the Attorney General's office, yes, as child protection, but also customer service and making sure that at least when it comes to our role in litigating those cases, that the cases are being moved efficiently and responsively for the litigants. I mean, one of the things that I hear a lot about, put aside, problems that litigants may have with individual judges, is just how expensive it is for families that are going through the family court system to have their cases resolved and how long it takes. And so in cases where you may not have, hot disputes, but where people just want to kind of move their family through the process, you want to make sure that they can get through without putting an undue financial burden on their families. And so, talking with the lawyers in the Attorney General's office who know that system and working with them to propose reforms that might be useful, I think is important because, the Attorney General's office with 200 Assistant Attorneys General involved in the court system every day, I think have a fair amount of insight into how things can work better, how things can be staffed better, and how the system can better serve litigants.
Victor, can I just add one thing, Victor? I don't want to misinterpret your practice. I mean, I'm just saying the legislative branch actually is trying to make reforms, but to me, it's the raw emotion of the court is such a challenge. And I'll be honest, there is a lot more lay people on the Judiciary Committee now, and I'm not sure they appreciate when people come up and criticize the judges. Whatever decisions are made, as you know, someone's going to be upset in the family court situation. They take it out. They try to retry their cases before the Judiciary Committee because the judge made the decision. And I just think it's fair. And I'll be honest, if you're a new judge, you're probably the last court you want to be in is family court because 8 years later you're going to be attacked. And I think most of the time unfairly, but it's really a realm of the legislature. And we've made some reforms over the past few years, but you can't make them overnight. You have to kind of ease into it. You're probably much more familiar than we are.
Yeah, I got some pushback on the GAL reform bill we did a year or two ago. Some of the family lawyers, when I see them now, they're like, "Did you have any family lawyers on the staff?" I thought we did. So there's still more work to be done. Any other thoughts or questions?
What can we do about all these calls generated on cell phones and business phones, home phones that are driving people crazy? I mean, I get calls using local numbers.
Mm-hmm.
There has to be something that can be done. On my office phone, I mean, I get calls all the time selling stuff or just giving a recording. It's really very annoying, and I think that the state, maybe the AG's office can do something maybe from a consumer standpoint. That there's a lot of those are scams.
Right.
So the do not call list has obviously been a failure.
Right.
And the problem here is that a lot of the calls that people are getting now originate from overseas or originate from voice over internet protocol systems that aren't subject to kind of traditional regulation, right? And so this is a national problem. It's not just a Connecticut problem. People in Pennsylvania and California are getting these calls as well. And so I think the most important body to address this is the United States Congress. But in the absence of that, I think, particularly when it comes to Connecticut consumers that are being scammed, partnering with the United States Attorney's Office and in investigating some of these cases where there may be extra-jurisdictional investigative steps that need to be taken is an important way to approach the problem. And then, we have the added challenge of how is consumer data being secured, right? Because sometimes these folks are getting your number because either the businesses that you interact with haven't secured your information properly, or because they've then traded it in the secondary market. And so in those cases, the Attorney General absolutely does have an important role to play in making sure that companies doing business in Connecticut are securing customer privacy adequately and not negligently, and also making sure that they're not engaged in any unlawful trading of it. That is something within the jurisdiction of the Attorney General's office. That's not going to solve the problem. The problem is national and even international in scope, but it's a way to make sure that businesses that are handling sensitive consumer data are handling it properly.
Yeah, there's going to have to be a federal overlay to all this stuff because calls are emanating from out of state or overseas. But Chris is right. I mean, frankly, I think what's going to have to happen is the AG's office, whether it has one state or a collection of states, are going to have to put an emphasis on it, and actually, for the sake of using the vernacular, make an example of a couple of companies that just skirt the law or ignore it. Yeah, we all get the same thing. You get 57 phone calls. Hey, you want a cruise? No, I didn't. Thanks for coming. I wasn't there. A lot of the rules are honored in the breach, and you're not going to stop everybody. But the AG's office can at least put an emphasis on it, shine a light on it, and maybe tamp it down a little bit. I mean, but anytime you're dealing with phone calls, especially across state lines and across national lines, the FCC's got to get involved, and you're probably right, maybe the Congress. But a collection of AGs, because this is sort of the new flavor of Attorney Generals. Everyone sort of teams up, and more often than not, it seems to be the Democratic Association, the Republican Association, but not always. There's some good efforts going on, regardless of party. This is probably one of the efforts that could be. So who cares what letters after your name? This is something that everybody wants and needs. And so maybe a collection, because if Congress can't do it, or the Jeff Sessions can't do it, or whomever, a collection of attorneys general can do it, or at least take a shot at it.
In the past, the legislature tried the do not call list, and I think it worked for the time being, and now, once they figured out, they went around it. So, truth of the matter is, whoever wins for your next Attorney General is not going to be able to, there's no miracle cure here. And that person can make it a priority, as both my colleagues have said, but I think we can make it a bigger priority, try to address it, but I think really, and it appears to me Washington will not address it, I don't think, the current composition. Because that's all, a uniformity nationally would be the solution. It doesn't look like it's going to happen at all. There's no appetite. I haven't heard of any appetite. So, again, and George Jepson, to his credit, has worked in a bipartisan fashion on different pieces of litigation, and this is one right for whoever wins to pursue that in a bipartisan fashion. But it won't be easy because offshore, and I don't think they're big companies necessarily. They're scammers, so it's a challenge. It's certainly frustrating, and we hear you, but whoever wins can work to address it, but there's no miracle cure here.
Yeah, and actually, technology may actually solve the problem. I mean, they're actually working on apps or programs or resident applications on your phone that can help screen some of this, but someone will always skirt around it. So, and one of the interesting points, there's only maybe a couple of more questions, but some of the emphasis or some of the answers you've heard here is how attorneys generals have been joining forces to do things that are not necessarily being done on a national level. I'm frankly in favor of that. I'm a big states' rights person. I believe the states only cede certain limited authority to the federal government. That authority is kind of either grown or metastasized to a point where a lot of states have kind of lost authority over state issues and state functions. And one of the ways to do that is to actually either challenge the federal government, regardless of what party's in.
There are attorneys
There
general
are attorney generals talking about it.
challenged and claimed
Yeah,
that
yeah.
it's a violation of the Equal Protection Clause, the manner in which they targeted blue
Yeah.
states like Connecticut.
Yeah, it said some people could argue as politics, and it's possible. It's possible. And I got news for you. I'll say this to Chris, I'll say it to everybody here. If the Trump administration or the next president, whatever administration is in, if they're stepping on the state of Connecticut, our citizens' rights, whether it's by a tax law, whether it's by environmental law, whether it's by federal mandates, which is really the main driver in my opinion. I mean, we send down $1, get it back about 63 cents, and the feds tell us how to spend what's left of our own money on local functions, how to build bridges and schools and clean up our own local beaches. That's got to stop. So the interplay between the federal and state government is one of the main tenets of what I think the AG has to start pushing back on. Not always just filing a lawsuit, but actually start working it from the state end and the federal end, whether it's in court or out of court.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that, because there are a whole lot of things that, in my judgment, the Trump administration has done, and I don't know whether you supported President Trump or voted for him, I'm not sure, that have infringed upon Connecticut's ability to legislate public health and public policy in our own state, on everything from the net neutrality repeal to the manner in which they're challenging the way we protect our undocumented communities and dreamers, to the state and local tax deduction, to the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act that's working its way through Congress right now, which would undermine our state's gun laws. And so I'm very pleased to hear you say that as Attorney General, you would be challenging the Trump administration on that type of legal overreach, because it threatens people in Connecticut every single day.
No, I'm not saying I would challenge the Trump administration on that type of federal overreach. What
Okay.
I'm saying is I would challenge any administration on inappropriate federal overreach, whether it's Trump or Obama or Clinton or Jones or who's ever going to be next. Because that's exactly what's been happening for the last 60, 70 years.
So on those
60,
examples
70
that I
years.
mentioned.
So on those examples, so for immigration, there's always, this is the funny part, right? So you have the state of Connecticut that's been around, had a constitutional form of government since the 1600s. We arguably were the oldest constitution on the planet. Some of the guys at France think they're older. I think Connecticut probably beats them. So, this is our third, arguably fourth form of federal government. You had the Constitutional Congress, then you had the Articles of Confederation, then you had the U.S. Constitution, and some people have argued that the 14th Amendment created a fourth federal paradigm. But the state of Connecticut and other states have always been in existence before and in addition thereto. So, how the interplay between states' rights, states' autonomy, and state authority, and the federal rights and autonomy has been at the center of our national discussion since the Federalist Papers, and it continues through the day. So, so the immigration issue is interesting because that is one of the things that we expressly ceded to the federal government. So it's kind of interesting that and this happens regardless of political party. Everyone uses these arguments like a sword and a shield. One year you got a Republican arguing states' rights, but then the next year you have a Democrat. It doesn't matter, DNR. You have the other party arguing states' rights in order to drive their particular issue. Immigration is a federal issue. Immigration is a federal issue. It just is. I mean, it's expressed in the U.S. Constitution. But some of the other things are not. Classic example. Paul mentioned some environmental issues. I mean, when I was up in the State House, we were trying to find money to clean up things and do things that the DEP needed to do. And there were pots of money laying, arguably, in Hartford that we couldn't tap because that money that came back from a federal grant had earmarks on it or had restrictions on it. Wait a second, we send $1, get back 60 cents, and now I can't clean up that beach because this money, which was mine to begin with, has got to do this trout farm. That's the kind of stuff that we can push back on, whether the lawsuit may be too aggressive, at least it's at the outset. But that discussion has got to start happening, both legislatively and potentially by the AG's office. So whether it's the Obama administration, the Trump administration, or the Jones-Paul administration next, the AG's office has got to protect the citizens of the state of Connecticut from federal overreach.
Well, we have 10,000 kids sitting in Connecticut right now who are dreamers, who were given protections under DACA that the President of the United States and the Republican Congress have threatened to repeal. Now, those are Connecticut residents. They've been conferred rights by President Obama's order protecting them. And state attorneys general will be going to court to protect them in federal court. So to say that immigration is a federal issue when you have 10,000 Connecticut residents who are contributing to our state every day and are a threat of removal by the Trump administration is, I think, passing the buck on a community that we need to protect. And absolutely, you can count on this, that if we have a Democratic attorney general, the moment that 10,000 Connecticut residents are subject to the threat of removal, who are dreamers, were brought to this country and are contributing to this society, I will be the first in line in federal court to defend them. And I hope that you would too.
Well, you know what, the first thing we had this issue up in the State House 4 or 5 years ago when we did our own, call it DREAM Act, put quotes on that. The discussion, rather than driving a political discussion about victims and villains, what the discussion that should be getting driven, and the AG's office can't necessarily do this, I mean, this is more of a legislative policy-driven analysis, is let's get those folks legalized now. You were born here, you were brought here, whatever you call it, whatever the definition is, let's find a path to citizenship, because guess what,
Yeah,
it's not their fault.
But Washington isn't achieving it. That's the ideal. They get it done, they finally get a deal, and it's over.
Yep.
But, it's, the next Attorney General is gonna have to look at all these issues. And, personally, I think some of the excesses of the current administration have to be addressed by the next Attorney General. And listen, I'm, with the partisan side, throw it aside, it's basically what's best for all the people of Connecticut. Net neutrality is important to the people, the dreamers, the environmental issues, the risk to the people. So I support Chris, and things you mentioned I would support also.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic that's going on with the current administration, because the last administration did a lot of things arguably by fiat. And there's legal arguments going about, the executive order, is it a valid legal act from the executive? But then, so the current administration comes in and undoes it by fiat. So if it's good by fiat, the undoing, it should also be good by fiat, but then people, again, are using these arguments like swords and shields. Like, well, it's only good if I agree with it, but now it's not good because I disagree with it. It's a law school exam more than it is anything else.
It's not a law school exam to the 10,000 kids who are a threat of removal, who were conferred certain rights by DACA, and now they've had them threatened.
But were they conferred those rights?
Rights by DACA, by the president, by President Obama. Okay? So it's really the president's call as to whether or not to continue, unless the Congress steps in.
You can't say they were conferred rights.
I disagree with both of you on that, because there is already litigation that the Trump administration's rescission of the executive order was arbitrary and capricious and unlawful. And that's an argument that needs to be made. And it should be made when 10,000 lives hang in the balance. And if you don't think so, that's fine, just say it.
Arbitrary and capricious is more an argument against the judiciary as opposed to the executive.
Right.
Not accurate.
Huh?
Not accurate. Same thing with net neutrality. The Federal Communications Commission, which is an executive branch agency,
right,
repealed net neutrality, right? Mm-hmm. And the arguments that are being made right now.
How did net neutrality get passed, though?
Was the FCC went and after an exhaustive process concluded that the internet should remain free and fair and neutral. The FCC then repealed it, and the argument is that having done so as an executive agency, it was arbitrary and capricious, and by the way, infected by fraud, with some 2 million comments that were submitted under fraudulent identities.
Well, it's not arbitrary and capricious on the way, and it can't be arbitrary on the way out.
So the question is whether you, as Connecticut's Attorney General, are going to represent the people of Connecticut and using the legal authority you have to do that and to press their case in court. And you can say, well, both sides do it, and I'm just going to kind of decline to bring that case. Or you can say, no, I am going to make the sound legal arguments in favor of the 10,000 people who are here and in favor of net neutrality in Connecticut. And that's an easy thing to do.
And the way you're framing the issue is actually it's actually erroneous, because the way you frame the issue is like, okay, these rights came out of the vapor, so now I have to protect these rights. However, the way those rights came out of the vapor is not the way they can get undone out of the vapor. So what you're doing is driving a political argument as opposed to driving a legal argument. What you're doing is going to pander to headlines as opposed to try and help people. So if we're actually going to try and help the 10,000 people who you say their lives hang in the balance, their lives are going to be disrupted by this. If we're actually going to try and help 10,000 people who are here in the state of Connecticut, what we do in the state of Connecticut is create some kind of paradigm where they're not just names in a press clipping, some kind of paradigm that gives them some level of protection, some level of path toward citizenship, some level of certainty, so we know what they're going to do. Just suing the federal government saying, look what a horrible person, because this is what happened last time. There were Republican attorney generals suing the last administration for the same thing, saying it was arbitrary and capricious on the way in. And right or wrong, we can have that fight. But what all that's doing is driving a political discussion as opposed to helping drive some policy changes or to try and help protect people.
Well, John, the state of Connecticut General Assembly has no authority to confer citizenship rights upon 10,000 Dreamers here in Connecticut.
Well, then why did we do it? So you're telling me that
We've
the
never
DREAM
done
Act that Paul and I voted on and actually got passed, so you're saying that act that was passed by the legislature, state of Connecticut, that did confer a certain amount of rights, that act was ultra-virus?
It did not
That's
confer.
an interesting expression.
Well, I'd be surprised if Paul thinks that piece of legislation conferred citizenship rights.
He gave him rights.
On
some rights,
document
but not
residents.
He gave him rights,
Okay.
right?
But I still think, the bottom line is, we have a lot of discussions on it. I think the litigation is important to try to fight for these people, the 10,000. I'd rather not just throw the ball and walk away, though. I think I would continue the legislation that Jepson is pursuing to try to protect these people. And then hopefully someday, maybe it's a pipe dream, Washington will actually pass something and get it addressed. It doesn't look like it in the recent, but maybe next year we can get it done.
But I do think it's important, though, and for people to know whether you as Attorney General would, in fact, sue the Trump administration and challenge the repeal of the DACA program, or not, because Paul and I have both said that we would, and I haven't heard what you would do.
To sue the Trump administration for the repeal, for his executive order that rescinded an executive order? No, because that's a big waste of time.
Okay.
All you're doing is driving headlines. They're not trying to help people.
Well,
So
it was
instead
not
of
a waste
giving
time because
10,000
the
people
federal
false
district
hope.
court- The federal district court in the District of Columbia, which heard this case, concluded that
They didn't hear this case. They're
that the plaintiffs had made their case that they would suffer irreparable harm if this repeal went into effect, and ordered the Trump administration to keep the
That's a-
DACA program. Hang
see,
on,
that's
ordered
a
the Trump
preliminary
administration.
injunction. That's a
Ordered the Trump
preliminary
administration
injunction. That's
to
not a
keep the
substantive
program
decision.
open and to continue to accept applications. And so for you to say that litigation is a waste of time.
That's not what we're saying.
That's what you just said.
What you're saying, if you're going to file litigation, and listen, this is what some of our previous attorneys generals have done. They drive headlines. They don't help people. If you're going to try and use the office to try and drive headlines and give people false hope, if you're going to try and use the lawsuits in order to just drive a political agenda that gives people false hope, I don't think that's the right way to go. If 10,000, and I'm assuming your number's right, and I think that's the number I've heard. I think that's about the right number. So if there's 10,000 people here in the state of Connecticut that want to be Connecticut state residents, they want to be U.S. citizens, we as a state, we as an attorney general, we as a legislature can and should do things to help foment that. But because it's an immigration issue, we have to do that in conjunction with our federal government. We can't just throw the ball on the field. You're right. So, okay, you guys do it. But what we shouldn't do is give people false hope by constantly saying, "I'm here to protect you. I'm bringing a lawsuit." Well, guess what? You got preliminary injunction in the district. That's not a substantive decision. That's saying, you know what? Everybody, don't do a darn thing until we have a substantive discussion. That's all that is.
That's right, and then the litigation can proceed.
And then the litigation can
And
proceed.
as you know, when an injunction is granted, the court needs to find that the plaintiffs have a substantial likelihood of success on the merits. And so for you to suggest that an injunction, it means nothing about the merits of the case, is just wrong. And for you to suggest that we should just, as an attorney general, abdicate our responsibility to protect our citizens when it comes to our principal authority.
Are they our citizens, though?
Our residents. When it comes to
There
our
you go.
principal authority.
See, here you go. And
When it
that's
comes
it.
to our principal authority to protect our residents, which is to bring litigation, I think would be, an abandonment of your job.
It's possible that we're using the two different terms for the same thing. There are ways to drive this discussion. Most of it's legislative, but listen, you can play games with substantial likelihood of success, status quo, all this other stuff. And the good thing is the lawyers in the room, ooh, this is kind of cool. The average citizen thinks, oh, we've won a case. No, you didn't. It's false hope. It's false hope. And we consistently do that. Sorry.
What difference would it make if the person was a citizen or not? Law School 101, privilege and immunities applies to citizens.
Applies to people here.
Due process, pro applies to everybody.
Right.
So to the extent that there's a due process or equal protection issue in the enforcement or repeal of any law or any executive order, it's irrelevant as to whether the person affected is or isn't a citizen.
I think that's
Their
right.
access to the court and their access to constitutional protection is there.
I think that's right. I do think that's right. That is right.
But I mean, I think we have to, I would pursue it and Chris would pursue it, and we're not just throw it away and walk away from it. I mean, and you can't guarantee success, but it's from my opinion that I would proceed forward, and, I won't throw in the towel because of potential
That's right.
hurdles.
And what I'd like to see the next Attorney General do, regardless D or R, is to frame a strategy that's actually going to get something done, not just get another headline, because that's all we've been doing.
I think George did a much better job. I think George was not fighting for all headlines in his decisions, I'll be honest.
It's funny, when I was going to run for Attorney General regardless of George stepped down or not, and it was great, because I've been on Channel 12 probably half a dozen times saying, that Jeffson guy's doing a pretty darn good job, so I knew what his first commercial would be. He has done a better job. He has, by trying to keep things a little under the radar. He's issued some opinions on some labor issues, on some of these issues, when we were trying to pass laws that I thought were right. I do.
Well, he got in within 6 months, he dismissed 300 cases.
Yeah.
So, he really got rid of some of the
Yep.
frivolous cases.
He has done a much better job. But again, if we're going to go back to the days of saying, I'm here to protect you, these are villains and this is victims, and if the AG's office is going to step into the villain versus victim mantra, that's a political discussion. And there's always politics, I understand, it's still, he's still running for an office. But that's not helping people. And that's...
It's not, I gotta say, I think, having been a public interest lawyer for many years, having been a Justice Department prosecutor for almost 10 years, we don't look at the world in terms of victims and villains. We look at the world in terms of what is lawful and what is unlawful. And when people engage in behavior that is unlawful or that exceeds their authority, it has to be challenged. Not because you're looking for headlines, but because that's your job.
Yep, that's right. That's right. But at the same time, you've got to be doctrinally and structurally equivalent with the way you approach these things. If something is legal because of an executive fiat, that something can get done by virtue of executive fiat. That doesn't mean you don't try and press the case in a different battlefield. But you can't contradict yourself. Well, the president said A is legal. Now the new president said A is not legal. Or we're going to do A, now we're not going to do A. Well, if it's good on the way in, it's good on the way out. But that doesn't mean you don't prosecute the effort somewhere else.
Well, I think we just have a disagreement on that.
Yeah, next topic.
That's a good topic, though. It is, and it's an important one too. So.
There you go.
Gun rights?
Well, again, whoever wins, the next Attorney General is not going to be, I've been a policymaker for 24 years. I voted for, this year I brought out the bump stock bill in the state Senate, got it passed whether people disagree or not. I voted for the post-Newtown legislation, but me in particular, I will no longer be a policymaker. So your next Attorney General will be defending the laws, basically, and I'm comfortable defending the laws, as long as, so far, I think the gun laws are fully constitutional. If something were to pass, it's the job of your next Attorney General to make that person's analysis, but I certainly support the recent reforms of the legislature and would defend them in court if there certainly could be challenges to the gun stock piece of legislation this year, but I would certainly defend that.
Right. I also voted for, what was it, SB 1160? I also voted for that. That was obviously it was a troubling set of facts that drove the discussion, obviously. And that was an interesting bill because it sort of merged three separate efforts. One was device controls, one was mental health improvements, and one is school security. And so when it was all devices, I and others said no, no, no. Democrats and Republicans alike. It's one of the times that the letter after your name didn't always drive the issue. So once we were able to to amp up the mental health screening capabilities, funding, and a process, and then also help with school security funding, merge those bills together, diminish some of the needless device controls, as a combined bill, I thought it was the right thing to do, and I voted for it. I'd do it again. The Attorney General there's only so much the AG would do in a civil context about the bump stock bill and stuff like that. But we live in an interesting dynamic now because it's you get some folks who think the Second Amendment is absolute. Basically you should be able to own an F-16, and they believe it at their core. and they can pitch cogent legal arguments to support that. I don't know that I agree with that. In fact, I know I don't. And I don't think the courts do either. That's why 1160 was upheld. But, I'm a gun owner. I was an NRA member back in the day, way before I got elected for a couple of times. I actually represented some NRA directors in a corporate governance dispute. A lot of people don't realize that the NRA is the oldest civil rights association in the United States. It was formed in New York. It's a New York not-for-profit corporation. So when there was an election ballot dispute, I represented a board faction. They're actually a more conservative board faction, but they were our clients. It was an interesting group of gentlemen from all around the country in the state of New York, because that's where the lawsuit was. That's where the lawsuit was. So actually, I met Heston and LaPierre and all those guys, or worked with them as part of I got a good view of the NRA. This is 15, 20 years ago.
If that passes, right, the Attorney General, if I'm Attorney General, I will challenge that law as exceeding the authority of Congress to legislate in the area of public health and public safety, which is something that has been traditionally reserved to the states. So that's how I see the gun safety issue playing out over the next number of months.
And one of the, it's sort of feeding back on what I was talking about a minute ago, we all were, the prime source of violence with guns, and we learned this when we did the grueling session for 1160. The main device being used in violence with guns is illegal handguns getting shipped over state lines, coming up I-95, coming from down south, and getting dumped into our cities. We know where the guns are coming from. We know where they're going. We know who's getting them. But what's not happening is enforcement of existing federal laws to stop that trafficking. So one of the things that I was able to cook into the 1160 bill, which is one of the things when we were negotiating what's coming in, what's coming out, was to fund the illegal handgun shipment task force that the state put in place 15, 20 years ago, the last time this thing hit the radar screen before everything got defunded, to actually help stop some of these shipments. So I worked with the chief of police in Bridgeport, with the local FBI agents, some other DCF guys. We basically work with each other, talk to each other, figure out what has been working, what hasn't been working, what needs to happen. And they gave me a great education. One of the things I would do as Attorney General is to force our federal government, I don't care who's in charge, D or an R, to actually enforce the laws that are on the books, and to actually do their job. Whether it's probably the FBI here, do their job. Stop the illegal shipment, interstate shipment of handguns across state lines. Because everyone, it's cliche now. The only guys who break the gun laws are the guys who break the laws. Well, that tends to be the truth. So there's got to be some. We increased our background checks, mental health screening. I thought all safe storage laws, all that stuff was good. I voted for it. But the real source, the real thing we have to focus on is the bad guns getting in the hands of the bad guys and coming across state lines. And I, as Attorney General, will make sure our federal government starts doing its job and stopping that or enforcing those laws. Because that's the prime cause of violence with guns, or the crime ingredient. It's not the cause; it's the ingredient.
Sue the federal government.
You probably would.
Right now.
Probably would.
John,
And I would.
Well, just so you know, I was in charge of the Project Safe Neighborhoods program in New Haven, which was the federal government's anti-gun violence initiative in New Haven, which had locations in Hartford and Bridgeport. And one of our responsibilities was, in fact, to stop gun trafficking into the state. And we did it. And we used the laws that we had. The problem is that there is not a national solution to the gun crisis. We don't have universal background checks, which I don't know if you favor or don't favor. I'd like to know that. We haven't closed the gun show loophole, which I don't know if you favor or don't favor that. But part of the reason that people who are bent on illegal behavior with guns are getting access to those guns is because they can buy guns in states that don't have those background checks, where there's no national program, and then bring them into Connecticut. So if you're focused on compelling the federal government to do something, you should be encouraging your Republican allies in Congress to pass universal background checks, close the gun show loophole, number one. Number two, one of the things that we need to be focused on at the Attorney General's office is how we can prevent the laws right now that are working their way through Congress from going into effect. That is the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act. I don't know what your position is on that, but that is the most fundamental threat to our state's gun safety laws, which you helped pass.
Yeah, I don't know if that's I don't agree that's the most fundamental threat, but I agree it's a concern. The universal background check, I don't understand why that thing, this is not a debate, but this is actually a question. I'm gonna give you the answer. Because it seems like that gets pushed up every 5, 6 years, state level and the federal level, and everyone seems to say, yeah, that's a great idea, and nothing happens. It boggles my mind. Because we did almost sort of have a universal background check system put in place, I think it was in conjunction with the Brady Bill back in the 80s or the 90s. Maybe it wasn't strong enough, but, so that model,
I think it was reversed.
yeah, and then it went away.
It's because
They expired, that's
The
right.
NRA opposes it.
It expired, they got it there.
The NRA opposes it, Republicans in Congress oppose it, and that's why we
Yeah,
have.
I don't even know if that's, I mean, I know the NRA opposes it, or has opposed portions of it. I can't speak for that, but it seems to me that I tend to agree, universal background check of some sort, or some common set of universalness, that's not a word, but some common, background check elements that all states should buy into. So whether that's mandated through the federal government or that's done by interstate compact,
But ideally, it's done passed by Congress, that's the most uniform.
assuming it's
And I think
it's
most-
enforceable,
most
and I think
NRA
it
members
probably
support
is.
that, but it still doesn't get supported.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I think, even if there was a legal challenge, I mean, whether you do it from the underneath with interstate compact or it's a viable act of Congress, so be it. I tend to agree. With it. It's baffled me when the universal background check, the Brady Bill stuff went away, that it just cratered.
Right.
And I don't even think it was a Democrat or Republican majority or minority, because it's been laying around for years, and no one's picked it up, whether it was a Democrat in the White House, a Republican in the White House, when the Democrats had the majority of Congress, and now the Republicans, have it's been laying on the ground for 15, 20 years. So it's a lack of political will, not necessarily one party versus another. So, well, is anybody? We're almost out of time. I know it's been a small group. I know a couple of people look hungry. Does anybody else have any questions? There's a couple of staffers here who look hungry.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, actually, I just had a quick question. So, I was just wondering, I think a big issue that's coming up for debate a lot right now is the issue of mergers going on and acquisitions at the corporate level.
Mhm.
And I was wondering, what do each of you see as your role as Attorney General to either monitor these the growth of these monopolies or these acquisitions, and then if you see that this would hurt consumer interests or small business interests or other interests in the state, what would you see as your role to prevent those mergers from occurring?
Yeah, well, there is an antitrust division of the AG's office now, which actually is charged with doing just that, is to make sure that there's no anti-competitive behavior going on. Most of that stuff gets done at the federal level.
Federal level.
Yeah, most of that stuff's done at the federal level, and the AG's office is sort of the flea on the tail wagging the dog on that stuff, but not always. Most of that's done through, especially in certain key industries, those mergers. But the AG, and to Chris's point, there's some of these things where the AGs could, in different states, D's and R's together. If there's a, like a merger of Eversource, some of the utility companies. That's an imperfect example because there's a utility division too.
Yeah, we have extra authority there.
Yeah, we have extra authority in that. But the idea is to make sure is to prevent any competitive behavior and to promote competitive behavior. And so whether it's done through Cutco, whether it's done through, I forget what the other act is in the state, most of it is sort of dovetailed in the federal.
But the current federal government, the administration is not enforcing it from my perspective as much, so it puts more burden on the state, but we don't have as much authority as Washington, so it's going to be hard. Yes, the next Attorney General can look out for it, but the actual authority is not, super expansive. We can do it in the example of Eversource, because it's a utility regulated by the state, we have more authority. We
Right,
can
right.
impose requirements on them in that merger. Still, I'm not happy that it happened, but that was a merger that at least we got some benefits out of at the time. Now, I think we're worse off because it's a massive entity that really does not provide as good coverage for Connecticut. But ultimately, even if it's, other less regulated entities, it's still harder. The administration's not pursuing it, it's harder for us. Your next Attorney General can do it, but the chances of blocking them is remote.
I think it's a critically important authority within the Attorney General's office, and it's one of the strongest and most effective units they have there. I worked very closely with Michael Cole, who supervises that unit, when I was at the Justice Department. And in fact, Attorney General Jepsen has used that authority with amazing success with the investigation he has right now into price fixing within the generic drug market. And that's going to be increasingly important as, the cost of living in Connecticut is so burdensome for people. One of the things we need to figure out is how do we bring down the cost of living? One way to do that is to go after folks who are artificially inflating prices. For example, there was some coverage recently of the practice of what's called death purchases, where pharmaceutical companies will see a smaller drug company that's producing a new drug, and rather than compete with it, they'll buy up the company and basically squelch the innovation. So to me, this is a very important tool within the Attorney General's office to kind of push back against what has been increasingly concentrated corporate power, particularly where the federal government is not really exercising its antitrust authority the way it should.
Yeah, and I think in the generic effort too that George did, I think there was other AGs involved in that as well.
Definitely.
Yeah, it was a multi-state effort, and it was a good effort. I mean, I applaud him for it, because that, to Chris's point, sometimes groups of AGs have to join together when the federal government either got their eye off the ball or can't figure out which way the step is forward. We can't always look to the federal government to solve these problems. In fact, I think we should look to the federal government way less frequently than we do on most of these issues. Yeah, the generic, I mean, that was a good effort. It was New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, I forget how many.
We led it. We're leading it.
Yeah, we're leading the opioid today. But again, we're talking, your question is about mergers. Opioid, of course, I certainly support that. But I think mergers is a tougher task for this.
Right, yeah. And that's always here again, you got the FDA, so who's in charge? The feds or the states? And sometimes you just gotta say we're in charge and fight it out, so. Well, listen, I'm gonna get some lunch, everybody.
All right.
Thank you much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you, folks. Oh, no. What'd you do? Oh, you all right? Paid for by Shaban for AG, John M. Whitcomb, Treasurer. I'm John T. Shaban, and I approve this message.